You are not going to believe how fast a quiet morning at my lake cabin turned into something that ended with sirens, legal threats, and one person realizing they had just made the worst mistake of their life. Because imagine forcing your way into someone's private property shouting rules and authority, only to find out the person sitting inside is not just the owner, but is meeting the state attorney general at that exact moment. And that is exactly what happened to me. Before I get into this, take a second to like the video and subscribe to HOA Revenge Files, because stories like this only get crazier, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. My name is Ryan, and the cabin I am talking about sits right on the edge of a quiet lake surrounded by tall trees and calm water. It is not part of any tight neighborhood. It is a private property that my family has owned for years. The closest thing to a community nearby is a newly developed HOA area about half a mile down the road. And from the beginning, there was always a strange tension between that HOA and anyone who lived outside their controlled space. When that HOA was first built, I did not think much about it. New houses, new families, new rules. It was their space. Not mine, but over time, I started noticing small signs being placed near the road. Notices about parking and noise, even though they had no authority over my land. At first, I ignored it because I thought it was just over-enthusiasm from people trying to organize their neighborhood. Then one weekend, I found a notice stuck near the entrance of my driveway. It mentioned compliance with HOA community standards, including property appearance and visitor regulations. That was the moment I realized this was not just harmless behavior. Someone in that HOA actually believed they had authority over my property. I removed the notice and went on with my day, but I also made a decision to document everything from that point forward, because something told me this would not be the last interaction. A few days later, I received a letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA board. It talked about cooperation and maintaining uniform standards across the extended community area, which made no legal sense, because my land was never part of their agreement. I checked my property records again, just to be sure everything was clear, and as expected, there was no connection at all. I decided not to respond immediately, because I wanted to see how far they would go without being challenged directly, and that decision turned out to be very important. Over the next couple of weeks, small things continued. Someone from the HOA drove by, slowly taking pictures of my cabin. Another time I saw two people standing near my property line, pointing at things and writing notes. It was strange, but still not serious enough to escalate. Then came the morning that changed everything. I had scheduled a meeting at my cabin with someone very important, someone I had been working with on a completely separate matter related to land use and local regulations. That person was the state attorney general. We had planned a quiet discussion away from the city, somewhere private, where we could talk without interruption. Everything was calm that morning. The lake was still, the air was quiet, and we were sitting inside going over documents, discussing legal frameworks and property rights, when suddenly we heard a loud knock at the door. It was not a normal knock. It was aggressive, repeated and demanding. Before I could even stand up, the door opened and a woman walked in without permission, followed by another man holding a folder. She looked around with a strong expression, like she was in control of the situation. And then, her eyes landed on me. She immediately started speaking in a loud, firm tone, saying that I was in violation of multiple HOA regulations, that I had ignored previous notices, and that she had the authority to inspect the property and issue penalties. Her confidence was absolute, like she had done this many times before, and expected compliance without question. For a moment, I just stood there letting her speak, because I wanted to understand exactly what she believed her authority was, and how far she was willing to push it. The man with her stayed quiet, flipping through papers, occasionally nodding as if confirming everything she was saying. Then she started pointing at things inside my cabin, mentioning guest limits, noise guidelines, and even the placement of items around the property, none of which had anything to do with any legal rule that applied to me. At that point, the room had shifted from calm to something else, something tense but controlled, because sitting just a few feet away from her was the state attorney general, quietly observing everything without saying a word. She had no idea who he was. She did not ask. She did not pause. She continued speaking as if she was addressing someone with no power to question her. Authority. I finally asked her one simple question. I said, "Can you explain under what legal authority you are entering this property and enforcing these rules?" And she responded without hesitation, saying that the HOA governed the entire surrounding area, and that all residents were expected to comply whether they agreed or not. That answer said everything because it showed a complete misunderstanding of property law and jurisdiction. But more importantly, it showed confidence built on assumption, not fact. The Attorney General looked at me for a brief moment, then back at her and asked calmly if she could provide documentation that extended her authority beyond the HOA boundaries. She seemed slightly surprised that someone else was speaking now, but she quickly tried to maintain control, saying that the community guidelines allowed enforcement in adjacent areas for consistency. That was the first time her tone shifted just slightly, because she was being asked for something specific, something that could not be answered with general statements or confidence alone. I walked over to a cabinet and pulled out my property documents, placing them on the table in front of her. I showed her the exact boundaries, the legal descriptions, and the clear separation from any HOA jurisdiction. Then I explained that this cabin and the land it sat on had never been part of any HOA agreement. She looked at the documents but did not fully process them yet. Instead, she tried to redirect the conversation back to compliance and cooperation. But by now the situation had already changed, because the person sitting in that room with us was not just a witness. He was someone who understood the law at the highest level in that state. The Attorney General introduced himself calmly, and the moment he said his title, the entire energy in the room shifted completely. Her expression changed, her posture adjusted, and for the first time since she walked in, there was hesitation. He asked her again, under what authority she entered private property without permission, and began issuing enforcement claims outside her jurisdiction. This time there was no immediate confident answer. She looked at the man with her, then back at us, trying to find a response that would hold up. The silence that followed was heavy, because everything she had said up to that point was now being measured against actual law. Not assumption, not confidence, not habit, but real legal authority. I could see the realization starting to form in her mind that this situation was no longer under her control, and that the person she tried to pressure was not alone, not uninformed, and not someone she could simply push into compliance. That moment right there changed everything, not because of anger or confrontation, but because truth had entered the room in a way she could not ignore, and from that point forward, every word, every action, and every decision she made would carry consequences she had never considered before. For a few seconds no one spoke, and you could feel the pressure in the air because everything she walked in with confidence about was now falling apart right in front of her. The man who came with her slowly lowered the folder in his hands and stopped flipping through the papers like he already knew this situation had gone too far. She tried to recover by saying there must be some misunderstanding and that she was only doing her duty as part of the HOA board. But her voice was not as strong as before, and that sharp tone she had when she entered was completely gone. The Attorney General stayed calm and asked her to clearly explain how she justified entering a private residence without permission and making enforcement claims that had no legal basis. At that point, she started stepping back from her earlier statements, saying that the HOA had been trying to maintain standards in the area and that sometimes lines could get blurred. But that explanation only made things worse because it confirmed that she acted without verifying legal boundaries. I stayed quiet for a moment, just watching how quickly the situation flipped, because a few minutes earlier, she was acting like she controlled everything, and now she was trying to explain basic decisions that should never have happened in the first place. The Attorney General then asked her if she understood the seriousness of entering private property without consent and attempting to enforce rules where she had no jurisdiction, and you could see it finally hit her. This was not about a warning or a small mistake. This had real legal consequences. The man with her finally spoke up in a low voice, saying they were just following what they believed was allowed. But even he did not sound convinced, and it was clear neither of them had actually checked anything properly before taking action. I explained calmly that this was not the first time the HOA had tried to interfere with my property. I mentioned the notices, the letters, and the people coming near my land, taking pictures and making notes, and how I had documented everything just in case something like this happened. That detail changed the situation even more, because now it was not just a single incident. It showed a pattern of behavior over time, and that made it much harder for them to dismiss it as a simple misunderstanding. The Attorney General asked if I had copies of those documents, and I brought them out, placing everything on the table. The notices, the letter, the dates, and even photos of people near my property line, all clearly recorded. He reviewed them carefully and then looked back at her, asking if she still believed her actions were justified. There was a long pause before she answered, and this time she admitted that she may have overstepped. But even that sounded like she was holding back from fully accepting what she had done. What stood out to me in that moment was not just the mistake she made, but how far she had gone with complete confidence without ever questioning if she was actually right. And that is what made the situation so serious. The Attorney General explained in a steady voice that HOA authority is strictly limited to the properties that are legally part of the association, and any attempt to extend that control beyond those boundaries, especially onto private land, is a clear violation. He also pointed out that entering a property without permission could lead to further legal action. Depending on the circumstances, you could see her processing every word now, because this was no longer about maintaining appearances or asserting control. This was about facing the reality of what she had done. She started apologizing, saying she did not intend for things to escalate this way, and that she thought she was acting in the best interest of the community. But by then, the situation had already crossed a line that could not just be undone with an apology. I told her that from my perspective, this was never about conflict. I had no issue with their HOA managing their own neighborhood. But the moment they stepped onto my land and tried to enforce rules that did not apply, that became something completely different. The man with her nodded, slightly like he agreed but did not want to say too much, and it was clear he was just as uncomfortable as she was at this point. The Attorney General then made it very clear that any further attempts to interfere with my property would not be taken lightly, and that they needed to ensure all members of their HOA understood the limits of their authority. He also mentioned that situations like this could escalate quickly if not handled properly, especially when there is documented evidence. That statement seemed to settle everything because it left no room for confusion or interpretation. It was direct and final. She agreed and said they would make sure no one from the HOA would contact me again regarding anything related to their rules or enforcement. And for the first time since she entered, she sounded completely certain, but in a very different way than before. This time, it came from understanding, not assumption. They both turned to leave, and as they walked out the same door, they forced open earlier, there was a noticeable difference in their energy. The confidence was gone, replaced with quiet realization. Once the door closed, the cabin felt calm again, like everything had reset back to normal. But at the same time, something important had just happened. Something that would probably stop any future issues before they even started. The Attorney General looked at me and said, "Situations like this happen more often than people think, especially when authority is assumed, instead of verified." And that simple line stayed with me because it explained everything that led to that moment. We continued our meeting after that, but it felt different now because what just happened was not planned yet. It showed exactly why understanding the law matters, and why documentation and patience can completely change the outcome of a situation. Over the next few weeks, there were no more notices, no more cars slowing down near my property, no more people standing at the edge of my land. Everything stopped completely, and it was clear the message had reached the entire HOA. What makes this story stand out is not just the confrontation, but how quickly things can go wrong when someone believes they have control without Ever checking if that control actually exists and how just one moment of truth can flip everything? If you made it this far, drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in that situation. Would you have handled it the same way or taken a different approach? And share this video with someone who loves stories, where everything turns around in the most unexpected way. Because on HOA Revenge Files, this is exactly the kind of reality that people do not see coming.